with beautiful soft goods wired cape, soft goods wired cape,
soft goods wired cape, soft goods wired cape.
I mean, we're all human, right? We all make mistakes. We've all had things kind of slip through the cracks. And me as a content creator, there's been a handful of instances where I'm doing some kind of edit, some kind of project, and I forget to maybe implement some kind of specific split between pieces of footage, or add a certain graphic on top of an image, or correct a typo inside of a title card. And then ever so often, a toy company simply just forgets to incorporate something into the figure that they technically went on record to say that it was going to be included. And that was the main controversy behind the McFarlane Toys Fidgetal, known as the No Man's Land Batman that you see before you here. Now, full disclosure, I did receive this No Man's Land Batman Fidgetal from McFarlane Toys directly to cover on this channel, but all of my opinions are going to be my own, which may or may not look a little bit familiar to you, and that is because right from the get-go, from initial renders to official reveals during the McFarlane Toys show, it was pretty clear to pretty much everybody, including me, that they were going to be utilizing the Nightfall Buck once again. And you can see it makes some form of a resurgence here, and God knows exactly how many times I've already covered it here on the channel, so I didn't necessarily want to spend too much time on the actual intricacies of the sculpt work and the detail as far as the suit is concerned, from the way that the proportions are, the crinkles on the suit, the way that the gauntlets and the boots are shaped on top of the suit, because it really is becoming a little bit redundant to the point where now I understand that we are getting into a business safe mentality of utilizing this buck, especially when you take into consideration the whole aforementioned and somewhat doom and gloom nature of the license possibly vacating McFarlane Toys and going on over to Mattel. So from a business standpoint, you're like, okay, maybe you can kind of make a little bit of an excuse from a business perspective to say, okay, we're just going to utilize and try to squeeze as much juice as possible in regards to this specific buck. But as a collector, it is becoming, it kind of getting to the point of you simply just paying for a skin, especially when you take into account the checkbox that you haven't exactly cleared yet as far as your iterations of Batman. And in this particular case, it's tackling the No Man's Land portrayal of the character based on a comic arc in which a massive earthquake hits Gotham City and Batman and the heroes are trying to restore as much order as possible, especially when the villains are going to be taking very clear advantage. But if you were to look at some of the panels from that comic, you'll notice that his physique is a little bit on the beefier side. He has a very specific portrayal, a specific frame that to me just makes me still beg the question as to whether or not it would have been a different alternative to maybe even move more units by building not necessarily a brand new buck, but simply just Frankenstein together a whole new ensemble from existing parts, and to make it to kind of give off the illusion, something that I've always kind of praised for McFarlane, being able to kind of hide within some of their iterations of either Batman characters or just frankly other DC characters, where they can just kind of, like I said, Frankenstein certain pieces of pre-existing figures and mold them in a combination, or rather a permutation, that we've never seen before and create the illusion of a brand new figure, even though if you really squint, you'll be able to pick apart the legs from this buck and then the torso from this use, and etc., etc. But here, it's just the straightforward Nightfall body, from the sculpt work to the musculature to the framing to everything, including the tooling and including the feel of the character. So gotta be honest, there's very, very little that I can really remark as far as the way that the sculpt feels, the way that the proportions and the articulation really feels, which is why to a certain extent I'm going to be tackling the articulation very, very quick, especially since we have some other much more attractive things to get to as far as what the main talking points of this figure have truly become. Because the articulation is pretty standard for that of a Nightfall buck. You have the head that is fully able to rotate the full 360, as well as being able to tilt very generously up and down, side to side, as you can kind of see before you there. The arms are pretty fluid, considering that that's one of the things I've always praised about the Nightfall buck, is the fact that the articulation on the arms, fully being able to rotate vertically 360 no problem, as well as very clear extension, is done very, very nicely, as well as some slight butterfly movement towards the front and back, as well as some slight shrugging motion due to the way that the dumbbell is designed inside. The biceps are fully able to rotate 360, two joints at the elbows that are fully able to bend up, and then of course the very flush wrist joint that is able to have the hands rotate all the way around 360 as well as bend inwards and upwards. And then the torso still feels pretty nice in hand as far as the very clear rotation 360 degrees, crunching and extending towards the back very fluidly and very extensively forward and back, as you can kind of see before you're there, as well as a slightly bit on the obliques side to side. Now, here is where we get a little contentious with the articulation for a very good reason, and that has to be around the waist, where it can kind of nudge side to side, but it doesn't move all the way across, and there's a specific reason why, but I'm going to reserve it momentarily. For now, I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit to the top leg joints that can fully extend the leg upwards like so, towards the back like that. Extension towards the sides can fully be done at the 180 degree angle right about right there. And then of course 2 knee joints that can fully bend the leg almost all the way up at the halfway point. And much like I've remarked very positively before about the Nightfall Buck, is that it's utilizing these cylindrical joints for the ankle that are flush with the rest of the boot. That makes it look natural, but still allows you very clear articulation as far as bending the foot upwards and downwards, rotate it all the way across 360 at a full horizontal kind of plane at the top of the ankle, or being able to pivot it inwards and outwards like so at an incline at the bottom of the ankle. And then of course you're going to have the toes that are fully able to bend up. But let's go back to that waist joint that, like I said, can only barely nudge, and that's because it's due to one of the only real 2 changes that I can pick apart from this specific utilization of the Nightfall Buck. Or rather, if you want to get super technical, it would be 3 changes. The one is probably the most obvious, which has to be the color scheme. It's based off of the actual palette that was utilized inside of the No Man's Land comic. And at that point, it truly does become subjective. I don't know if it's my preferred color scheming as far as the blue, but I really do dig the actual clash of the muted colors, then being contrasted by the poppiness of the yellow utilized on both the belt and the bat symbol here, specifically the design of the oval symbol that's very classic, yet still kind of specific to the No Man's Land incarnation. So it really depends on whether or not you vibe with this color scheme. I do like it. I don't know if it's in my top 5, but I really do like how pleasing it looks either in physical 3D representation with a figure, or rather pulled from the comics. In fact, I would say that it looks nice enough that if they were to incorporate, actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's in one of the Arkham games. I legit cannot remember which one it was. It's definitely in one of the Arkham games. I want to say it's Origins. I'm most definitely wrong, but I would be genuinely surprised if none of the Arkham games took advantage of having the skin in there. But apart from the color scheming, the 2 other noticeable differences as far as sculpt work is concerned is in fact that very large belt that's being utilized in circumventing the waist right here. It's very over the top as far as sizing, as far as the buckles, but most definitely the pockets that are sculpted very nicely here on the side, utilizing, like I said, that very vibrant yellow that stands out. The only downside, though, is that it's very much gripping the entirety of the diaper piece to the point where it's kind of limiting a little bit of the waist articulation in due parts. So that's just one thing to take note of. And then the other thing would have to be the very nuanced differences to the head sculpt. Of course, it's not a one-to-one recreation of the Nightfall Buck. It's not necessarily a repaint in that regard, but you'll notice that there are some aesthetical differences as far as the way that the chin, the expression, if anything, it kind of reminds me of the Batman Reborn, the Dick Grayson Batman that was utilized in that figure from a few months back, except this time he's not necessarily smirking all that much. There's some refinements made. I know it's not exactly identical, but it just kind of reminds me of that a little bit with the narrow, wide eyes right there. And then, of course, taking part of the blue and then replicating it on over here with the elongated ears. It's a nice look to the cowl, but again, it's just nothing that makes me go, oh my god, top 5 head sculpts of all time. Not necessarily in that regard. But let's face it, that's not going to be the main thing that people are going to be talking about. It's going to be the cape, which is of course a felt good cape utilizing nylon, which I'm not necessarily the biggest fan, but of course I always say that if you're able to stitch this thing and wire it appropriately, you could still be able to elevate the cape in a way that complements the figure. But as you can most definitely tell, it's looking incredibly fugly. And that's because, sadly, one of the biggest controversies that's probably going to hit the McFarlane Toys community probably this year is the lack of a wire inside of the No Man's Land Digital Batman figure here. Because it's one thing to have the nylon cape not have a wire. I mean, we've already had a handful of capes either this year or in the past year, 2024, that were felt good, whether it be cloth or nylon, and didn't have the wire. But that's okay because it was simply just a cutout cape that was then stitched at the very top here where the head and the shoulders meet and glued inside and adhered to the figure. That's okay. It's another to then stitch the actual rim here at the very, very end with a clear space and hole stitched out and fabricated in that style that you know for a fact a wire could have simply been implemented and injected inside and mass produced. And yet there it is with absolutely no wire. It's then a third thing to actually have one of your representatives, as shown at the beginning of this video, clearly say that the figure was going to have a wired cape during its reveal. Now, to play devil's advocate, that was the only mention of a wired cape. And so you're probably wondering what was exactly the case to remove the wire. Was it too costly? Was there some kind of budgeting reason? Was it a snafu in the marketing process or in the mass production process? And it feels a little strange that this isn't necessarily a standard DC Multiverse release at the $22.99, or I guess in this case, or in this market, in today's current marketplace, $24.99 from certain retailers. No, this is also technically a McFarlane Toys digital Batman digital figure, meaning that he is a physical figure that also comes with the downloadable code for a Batman figure NFT that could be utilized in McFarlane Toys Digital. And redeeming the code was pretty intuitive now that we gotten all the preliminary setup for McFarlane Toys Digital out of the way. And even though my commentary and my remarks about McFarlane Toys Digital still stands as far as hopefully bringing build-a-figure concepts and articulation, I also found it kind of cool that I managed to acquire a legendary drop for the No Man's Land Batman that came with the skin that looks kind of neat in this metallic sort of coat of paint. But it's still not doing anything to advocate the absence of a wire, because we've seen them do it before. I think we literally have another Fidgetal inside of this wave that has a wired cape and a cloth one at that, not even nylon, and yet she, spoilers in case you don't already know who it is, she does have the wire, but for some reason Batman here doesn't. I'm sorry, but I'm still not really being able to understand what the reasoning was, unless I end up being a fly on the wall during that meeting, especially when you consider the fact that it's yet again a repaint of an existing buck in the form of the Nightfall body that is not only utilizing that same buck again, but you're not necessarily doing any favors by including the exact same accessories. You have the same alternate hands that are these gripping hands next to the fisted hands that he comes on by default, or rather one of them that comes by default. You're able to kind of asymmetrically swap them out from when you pull the figure out of the box, and then you can utilize those gripping hands to then of course use the exact same Nightfall Batarang that's been included a handful of times before. If I was to squint and maybe reach, I would say that maybe they've kind of filed the tips of the wings here on the edges to be a little bit on the narrower side. But frankly, that's the only real difference or discrepancy that I was able to pull away from. Other than that, it's the exact same Batarang. So again, I'm not necessarily seeing anything here to warrant the absence of the wire. And when you're dealing with a fabric cloth cape, especially a nylon one that's using a much cheaper fabric, you see exactly what it's doing. It is looking incredibly ugly, difficult to manage, difficult to futz with here, especially towards the top. And with a potential definitive iteration of Batman that a lot of people like, especially from the No Man's Land arc, that's going to be borderline insulting. I'm not necessarily in that camp because I don't hold No Man's Land in that high of a regard for one of the more definitive iterations of Batman necessarily. Like I said, I like the color scheme. I like that particular palette to iterate on Batman, and again, this figure is still able to sort of skate by the fact that it's the Nightfall buck, and I'm still not taking away from the buck being pretty good with the articulation, with the proportions, the way that the plastic feels, etc. But I mean, just look at this framing here and seeing how the cape is just not kind of contorting with the body, or at least complementing the figure in a very posable way. It just feels like it's just kind of flinging off to the side. It's very unmanageable. It's even wrinkling a little bit in the center. And at this point, we're not even being terribly subjective. These are objective remarks that are legitimately damaging the figure. And it just makes me think of all the potential sort of wasted from what could be considered for others to be their definitive Batman. There's probably some fans out there who looked at No Man's Land Batman and thought, oh my god, I can't wait for McFarlane to do a figure out of that, only to then result in it not only being a fidgetal, where you already have a good chunk of the market probably looking at that code and going, this is already upticking the price, but then you're kind of taking away by not including a wire. I'm sorry, despite still being a huge fan of McFarlane Toys, of the DC Multiverse, and still being in love with what they've contributed to McFarlane Batman figures, this one still needs to take the hits, the good along with the very stark bad in this case. And therefore, the No Man's Land Batman Fidgetal is getting a 5 out of 10 from me. It would have been lower if it wasn't already for the things that the Nightfall Buck was able to get right and stand the test of time. But considering that this is the nth time we've seen this Buck, especially when on the horizon we have the alleged loss of the license, we need to be making bold strategies. And technically speaking, we are outside of the fidgetal wave in remarks to crowdfunding the Justice League, Zack Snyder Batmobile, or other iterations of the collector's edition. We got the Elite edition and then other properties kind of being indoctrinated into McFarlane Toys. But let's make sure that whatever remaining Batman to check off that are coming down the list here, down the pipeline, don't necessarily get shafted the way that No Man's Land Batman did here. But do any of you guys feel a little bit differently about the whole controversy surrounding Wiregate within McFarlane Toys with the No Man's Land Batman? Or do you think that this is simply just a forgivable mistake, it's just a snafu, and you're able to look past it? Let me know down in the comment section below, and while you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this review, thumbs down if you did not, and as always, stay humble, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.